Mr. Taylor, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. A week ago, my office put out our overview of the governor's budget, as we do every year. That gives you sort of our initial quick assessment at a high level about the overall budget context and some comments about a few of the governor's sort of major proposals. I just want to make a few comments, Mr. Chairman, and then we can get to your questions. Key drivers in your budget are clearly Proposition 98 and beginning with 1516 Proposition 2, the measure the voters just passed that helps set up our reserves and paying off our debts. The two also interact very closely. So you really have to understand those two, have a basic understanding of them to have a handle on your overall budget context. If you can start by talking about the current fiscal year, the 14-15 fiscal year that we're now halfway through, you can see the impact of Proposition 98. As Ms. Bosler said, they had revenues, or they have revenues going up about $2.5 billion, and virtually all of the money goes to Proposition 98. Now, I know there's still a lot of people, you must get a lot of questions as how can that be? How can you have that much increased money and it all goes to 98? Well, it's the method we decided to use to pay off in certain times, a test 1 year, when we have to pay off so-called maintenance factor. And based on that method, it requires basically every dollar until you pay off that maintenance factor to go to 98. So it doesn't leave anything else for other parts of the budget. It's great for education, not so good for the other parts of the budget. Now, the administration has come up in the revenue estimates to basically where we were in November. In our overview, we mentioned the possibility of having even more money in the current year in 14-15. That was based in part on the very robust estimated payments that we got in December. Now, those estimated payments flow over into January. People can pay up to January 15th on their final 2014 estimated payment. January estimated payments were not as good as we expected. However, we still think in the current year, you could easily have $1 to $2 billion more in revenue. And that's just based on the current state of the markets. The economy is performing better than I think either both finance and my office assumed when we looked at this earlier. So I think it's still possible you could have more money in the current year. Now, what are the implications of that? Well, similar to the $2.5 billion, if you have $1.5 billion more in revenue, it all goes to 98. So there will be no more money for other areas of the budget. Again, great for education, not so good if you want to spend on other things or build up your reserves or pay off more debts. It also has implications for your 15-16 budget, the budget you'll be crafting through your subcommittee process. If, in fact, you have a lot more money in May in the current year, what that means is it builds up your base of 98 spending that will tend to continue in future years. Should the markets have a correction or the economy slow, you then have committed to education spending that you really can't afford to the same level, and it's the non-98 side of the budget that will have to make the adjustments. So as we get to May, we'll be looking very carefully at what we think, where we are in the revenues, and what those implications are for your 15-16 budget. What it suggests is you might want to be very careful about making those ongoing commitments, both in education, because the last thing you want to do is send the message out to schools that you have this much more money to spend on ongoing purposes, and then you have to pull back on that. But the same thing is true for your non-98 part of the budget. So we'll be tracking revenues carefully, and obviously finance will be updating in May, as will we. But that's something just to be thinking about. Certainly the education subcommittee can be thinking about how would you want to spend more one-time monies should those come in the current year, and you have some good candidates for that. As far as the 15-16 budget, as Senator Nielsen mentioned, we do think it's a prudent budget, builds up reserves, pays off debt. You have to spend a lot of money to pay off just additional cost in the various health and social service programs. There's not a lot of money left over for new policy initiatives. I think perhaps the only major one from the administration is a proposal to restore the 7% reduction in hours in the in-home supportive services program. I would like to mention just some key policy areas. I think the governor deserves a lot of credit for raising the visibility on some really important issues, even if we think that there's a lot of work still to be done on those. And Ms. Bosler, I think, mentioned all of them. First, in infrastructure, she mentioned the deferred maintenance. And I think the administration has cited a $66 billion deferred maintenance number. Virtually all of that is in transportation. That's not to say that we don't have other deferred maintenance needs in higher ed and our buildings and things like that, but you're basically talking about a transportation deferred maintenance problem. And so the administration has not really offered any specific proposals. They're talking about coming out with reports and ideas later on. But this is an area that deserves your attention, in my view, about how are we going to make sure that we're just maintaining the roads that we have. And it's a very big problem. School facilities. The administration seems reluctant to have more state school bonds to pay for school facilities. And I think the administration has raised legitimate concerns. You have a lot of taxing capacity at the school levels, not for operations, but for infrastructure. So how do you best use that local taxing capacity? What do you think the role of the state should be in helping locals in pay for their facilities? These are very legitimate questions. Again, you don't have a lot of details from the administration, a few more than you had last year, but we think it is an important area to look at, and we hope to be able to help you in thinking about that important issues in the weeks to come. On retiree health, Ms. Bossler spent a lot of time talking about it. This is your last big unfunded liability that you haven't addressed. It doesn't mean you don't have unfunded liabilities, but in the case of CalSTRS now and CalPERS, you have mechanisms to pay those things off over an amortization period. But for retiree health, you don't. It's still completely a pay-as-you-go program, and we think it is deserving of your attention. And the administration deserves a lot of credit for, again, elevating the visibility on this issue. However, they don't offer you any money for how to pay for this because it's very expensive. It will require a lot of additional monies from the general fund, from special funds, hopefully from federal funds, to pay off this unfunded liability over a period of time. We think you should seriously consider using your Prop 2 debt payments as a very viable funding source for paying off your unfunded liabilities. You have at least 15 years worth. You can actually use it beyond 15 years, but for the next 15 years, you have to use it for debts. This is one of the 4 categories of debts that is provided for in Proposition 2, and it could get you a long ways, if not completely there, in funding the general fund's obligation. So we would seriously consider that as you think about your Proposition 2, the debt payments part of it, the half of the money that's set aside that has to go to debts, think about how you want to use that stream of monies to achieve some important debt repayments over that time period. In workforce development, again, the administration deserves a lot of credit. So this is a really good time to be thinking about how all of our workforce development, our adult education, our career tech, our apprenticeship programs, how do these all tie together? Where are there redundancies? Where doesn't it make sense? So again, I think they've put that on the table, but there's a lot of work to do. And I think the administration would probably acknowledge that. They don't offer, for example, any way that how do you rationalize the fact that you've got 70 consortia in adult education at the local level. You've got 15 economic development regional commissions at the community college level. You have 49 workforce investment boards. How do you make all those work together so that it's simpler for businesses and for individuals and for local governments to know what's going on? There's a lot of work for you to do, but I think it's well worth your effort. Turning just real quickly to higher education, because I know that's been a source of a lot of debate. And I think, again, the administration deserves credit for elevating the discussion, and I think there's been a lot of really good discussion about cost structures, about fees, about enrollment. There are some things, I think, some tension still in even the administration's own proposal. They're very critical, for example, of enrollment-based funding in UC and CSU. And we understand that in part because you don't want to just give, that's all that you give money out for is based on enrollment. You want to have outcome measures. The problem is the administration turns around and gives enrollment-based funding to the community colleges. So it must serve some purpose so they wouldn't be using it. So we don't think it's all or nothing. We think that you need to think about a mix of ways that you hold the systems accountable. And certainly having an enrollment target is a very reasonable thing to have. Finally, on tuition, this has been, I know, a very sensitive subject with a lot of people. We spend a lot of time now talking about who should pay for cost increases, students and families or the state. And that's a reasonable discussion to have, but in some ways it's not productive because you'll keep having it every year if you don't have sort of a policy or an approach of how much of cost you want students and families to pay and how much you want the state to pay. We've long advocated that having a share of cost policy makes a lot of sense. There's no right share. That's something you all would have to determine. But if you did have a share of cost policy, a lot of discussion that's now going on simply goes away. And the focus is completely on how much does UC or CSU want costs to go up? Why do they need costs to go up? And they have to justify that to students and their families in the state, because each of those would bear a proportionate share of those cost increases. But you don't get in sort of the back and forth that we have about who should pay for it. You sort of have a laser focus on, well, why are costs going up? And if the system can justify that, then costs should go up and fees should go up accordingly. I think that's a reasonable approach, and I think it really would help in your focus if you had such a share of cost policy. And just one statement to close off, Mr. Chairman, on the reserve. You have about a 3% reserve. That's much more than we've had in a very, very long time. That's a very good thing. But I tend to share Senator Nielsen's comments that given our volatile revenue structure, it's not going to provide you much protection should we have a quick downturn. The voters envisioned a maximum of 10% reserve. That's about $11 billion. I don't expect you to get to there right away or the next year or the year after that. But as we get to May, and the administration will be updating their revenue numbers, their capital gains estimates, I certainly hope that you can build that reserve up as quickly as possible, because it will spare you a lot of pain if in the next 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, you do have a downturn. It will make your adjustment process so much easier. And with that, Mr. Chairman, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. So, as I had suggested earlier, I just want to spend a few minutes on the revenue side. We can have endless conversations on all the expenditure side, and I'll address my comments and questions to both of you, and feel free to comment and respond as you like. And Mr. Taylor, I'm sure you'll correct me if my numbers are off, but I have a clear memory going back a few years. I think we crossed the $100 billion threshold for general fund for the first time in 2012-13. We were at about $103 billion. And in out-year projections, I'm sorry, 2008, right before the fall. Sorry, 2008. But in 2008, there were out-year projections for 12-13 that said just on the natural, due to inflation and population growth, that 103 would be about $120 billion. By 12-13. So we got to 12-13, of course the crash had occurred, and we weren't at 120 billion, we weren't at 103 billion, we were around 93 billion, and that even included the 6 billion that would be benefited to the general fund with the passage of Prop 30, and of course if there were trigger cuts, if Prop 30 hadn't passed, which would have put us closer to about 87 billion in 2012 without the passage of Prop 30. So about a quarter of our revenue just evaporated. So we've had a really serious revenue problem. Our constitutional responsibility, of course, to match our much more modest revenues to expenditures to our modest revenues. So here we are now talking about 15-16 and $113.3 billion general fund budget. It's a big number. And as Ms. Bosler pointed out, about 1.4% growth over the current year. But given that you had projected without a downturn, just with population growth and inflation accounted for, no other growth in programs, that would have been $120 billion a couple years back, 3 years back, so that we're still in relative terms, historical terms, in just from a revenue perspective, still in a very modest position with a population that continues to grow, modest inflation. We're nowhere near where we might have been if it hadn't been for global catastrophe. So we have endless needs, and on the expenditure side, we never conclude our debates as to what our top priorities are, how we manage all the infrastructural needs that have already been mentioned, the unfunded liabilities, the wall of debt, and then one other thing I'm sure we'll be addressing is our current level of funding on so many different issue areas, whether it's higher education, our courts, or social safety net, workforce development, all of that. So is any response just to where this $113 billion is in comparison or from a historical perspective, and not only, as you pointed out, we need to continue to watch our expenditures. You've suggested that the budget is tenuously balanced, but there's still need, I won't say need, I'll reframe it just slightly, we're still in a very modest revenue position.
I think that's certainly fair. We've had moderate growth coming out of the recession, which was a very deep recession. I think, Senator, I would probably tend to go back, as we have in various drills, back to 7, 8, or 8, 9, the sort of before the recession, and look at spending. And as you noted, you have to make a lot of adjustments to it because much has changed in the way that we fund various things. You mentioned the realignment. So if you took spending pre-recession 7, 8, you'd want to make adjustments for the realignment, the fact that we no longer have certain responsibilities. You probably want to make adjustments in some way for the fact that, well, we've shifted, as we may talk about more in the future, tuition or instructional cost at the segments more to fees. Well, the programmatic effect is very different from the fact that the general fund now spends a lot less on it. So it's really hard, given all of these changes, to do sort of an apples to apples. So if you're asking me on what we spent programmatically back in 7, 8, where are we now? Have we sort of kept pace with population and inflation? I couldn't tell you. We probably haven't. Maybe we're a little bit close, but we just haven't done that for a couple of years. But certainly that's different from looking at the revenue that we had projected. I'm sure the administration projected. That's the problem when you do multi-years, when you just assume continued growth. You know that's not going to happen. So I'm not sure I would start with the 120 as much as going back at a reasonable base year and then making some sort of adjustments we might tend to agree on. What are spending in per capita real adjusted terms compared with that year? And I'm not sure what the answer to that would be.
Is that something you could find for us?
I think we could take a shot at. Again,
Okay.
We're not going to agree on all of the different changes of what you should make adjustments for, but we could give that a go.
That would be helpful. Thank you. And, we're familiar with many of the areas where we've made very deep cuts in recent years. There are a few sore thumbs that stick up with regard to where we've seen significant expansion in our spending. One, of course, would be in the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So just wanted to see if there is any thought within the administration as to, and it's not quite fair or accurate proposal here. Clearly, there's been a lot of attention, specifically in the fact of realignment. But whereas we were about 3, 4, 5% of general fund spending on corrections going back 10, 20 years, we're closer to 10% today. Making reference to the future of California corrections, the blueprint that was put out back in 2012-13 to reduce the spending in corrections, we see even another $1 billion added just from 2013 to 2015 as proposed. When do we finally get a handle on this? And I know a lot of it is driven by some factors beyond our control, healthcare costs, the receivership, and some voter mandates that direct some of our policymaking. But when can we finally turn that corner? Or even if we don't know the answer to that, what's the vision here? Are we just going to live with 10% forever, or we think we can get back to closer to 5% over time? And again, in this size of a general fund budget, we're talking $5, $6 billion a year that could be going to higher education, if not a number of other places.
Yes, the Department of Corrections is an area that the administration continues to do a lot of hard work. A lot of the increased expenditures that we've seen have been driven by the 3-judge panel and by the receiver in terms of increased medical costs, the activation of the California healthcare facility down in Stockton, the additional expenditures associated with staffing that facility. Like local governments, we have incredible struggles in filling our mental health positions, and the need for additional positions continues to be something that the Department of Corrections struggles with in its compliance efforts with the receiver and with the 3-judge panel. I also just note that Proposition 47 that passed this past November has really caused significant ripple effects in the correctional system at the local level as well. And so the system really is one that's in flux. And because of that, we continue to monitor the prison population very closely to better understand exactly what our facility needs are. We continue to have 8,000 offenders in out-of-state facilities and contract facilities. That's also an issue. So there's a lot of real nuts and bolts management issues that the administration every day continues to work at to really keep a handle on the expenditures in the correctional system. So I don't have an answer about the percentage of the overall general fund and whether that will be reduced over time, but just want the committee to know that this is something that the administration is tracking very closely and will continue to monitor and work to reduce costs and also adjust to all of the changes that are occurring in the system.
Mr. Taylor, do you have anything to add with regard to our sustaining a 10% of general fund on corrections? I think it's the highest of any state in the country as a percentage of general fund. I think even at 5% some years ago, we were highest in the nation at 5%.
I mean, you have three main drivers. It's the healthcare costs, the number of people in prison, and your compensation that you pay your employees. And if you want to cut the cost, you have to go somewhere there. I mean, what we pay on healthcare is by far the highest in the country. We're a complete outlier. So, certainly it's an area we haven't had any control over in recent years, and yet it's sort of puzzling in a way that we could spend so much in order to be constitutional. I don't know what's happening in the other 49 states.
An issue we don't talk very much about in this committee, though I know Senator Wolk, among others, have talked about it in subcommittees and in policy committee, and that's the issue of tax expenditures. The fact of them is that they are passed by simple majorities. They're repealed by two-thirds majorities. Once they're passed, they're there. And unfortunately, we barely have any review of them. And just in recent years, we've seen, I think it's 2001, about $435 million in revenue that has been diverted as a result of tax expenditures, growing to about $1.8 billion in 2015. So that's almost fivefold. Mr. Taylor, do you think at some point we should be at least reviewing some of these? They don't have sunsets on them. I voted for one last year because it did have a stated goal and purpose. It did have a sunset. It did have a requirement to collect the data so that we could measure whether we were reaching the purported goals and purpose of it. But about $50 billion worth of income revenue that the state doesn't realize as a result of tax expenditures each year. At what point would the LAO suggest you've really got to look at this, because this is a balloon that just keeps expanding? You're not looking at it. You're not reviewing what's effective, what's not effective. Maybe you should continue to invest in some because you're getting great return on your investment, and others are just a waste of your money. And I recognize every one of these has a constituency, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be, in my opinion, giving that each one of them a good look at. And I want to get your take on it, because we're talking many billions of dollars here now.
Well, I'm going to date myself, Mr. Chairman, but one of the first things I worked on in the analyst's office back in the early 1980s was tax expenditures. So our office over the years has many times published reports and urged that you think about those commitments of funds, whether you call them tax expenditures, tax provisions, special exclusions. They're in many ways, many of them are just like an expenditure program, and you want to take a look at them. Doesn't mean they're bad at all. Doesn't mean that you don't want to keep them. I'm not sure there's too many votes probably in the legislature to repeal the mortgage interest deduction, even though we've suggested it's probably one of the worst targeted provisions in the tax code. So we've always argued that you should look at these just as you would look at all of your direct expenditure programs. And you are sort of stuck with the ones you have. When you create new ones, I think it's very important, like you would for an expenditure program, have a sunset because you don't have that annual budgetary review, so that you could look and see did it accomplish what you wanted, in the same way you would with an expenditure program. As far as going into the base, it's a little harder to do, obviously, because you need a 2/3 vote. And some measures you don't want to look at every year. Again, there's many provisions that most people would either think this is just a basic part of our tax code that we don't really need to look at every year. But we think you should have extensive review of those type of provisions that act very similarly to a direct expenditure program.
Ms. Bosler, any comment?
Just that absolutely tax expenditures are an important part, and they're certainly a component of what our revenues end up being at the end of the day. Our administration took on, in partnership with the legislature, the Enterprise Zone program and really did significant reforms there. I think that was a program that had, for many decades, had a lot of criticism about whether it was actually resulting in the economic growth that it was originally sold as. So that was an important reform that was put in place. It was those monies were replaced with a more broad-based manufacturing sales tax credit that is being implemented, and we are continuing to monitor the effectiveness of that.
Thank you. And the numbers I had used earlier were specifically for the research and development. Senator Nielsen has a comment, and then I'm happy to take questions. I think I'm sure everyone has any number of them. Okay.
Let me go back to corrections that Senator Leno dwelt on fairly extensively. At the end of the Cold War, there was what was called the peace dividend, and all the money that had been spent in the military that was not then now going to be spent to devise the Cold War was going to come back, and it would be spent wherever. What about the post-realignment dividend? Correction spending is really not going down. And some 40,000 inmates, parolees formerly under the jurisdiction and authority or supervision of the Department of Corrections are now the burdens of local government. Now, the states help that some, but how can we see correction spending continue to grow? I understand the mandates of the judges, but I watch it very carefully. And the judges have not been doing new thing after new thing after new thing that are costing us more money. In fact, if anything, I think that the administration are finally, plural, getting this a bit under control in terms of health care. So what's happening in corrections that with all 40-some thousand less and with some 10,000 more under Prop 47 going to be the burdens of the community and facing lesser consequences to get back in, so you're not going to have more admissions. What's going on in corrections? Somebody, can you enlighten me?
So the big driving factor has been the 3-judge panel and reducing the prison population in the state's facilities 231.5% of capacity. When we were at several years ago, there was extreme crowding in the prisons. There were triple bunks on all-day room floors, in gymnasiums, pretty much bunks in every nook and cranny in many of the state prisons. The 3-judge panel and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court really has dictated that that is not acceptable. And so over the last several years, we've been slowly taking actions and even in some cases building additional capacity where needed to bring the population down to the level that's been deemed acceptable by the courts in terms of overcrowding. At the same time, the receiver has continued to implement new and additional efforts to improve health care to the inmates, and those have cost money. Also, the Coleman Court, the court over the mental health component, has also added additional and new requirements on the department that have also required changed behaviors, additional staffing, and additional mental health professionals in the state prisons. So there really is not one thing that's driving the costs in the prisons, but there are many, many issues that are really outside of the state's control. But that said, the state is working very hard. Again, Proposition 47 is causing some additional changes in the system, and we are working very hard to monitor and stay on top of the changing population and adjust our management, adjust the infrastructure needs that we have in a timely manner as possible.
But all of that argues for adjusting down, not up. And far fewer are under the authority and jurisdiction. That is inarguable. I'd like to get to the bottom of this, and I'm going to ask staff to do some very careful scrutiny. I would like to identify what costs have gone up. Now, for example, facilities. The only thing I'm aware of that CDCR has done in facilities is rehab some of the Stockton facilities for mental health. It hasn't been building new capacity. It was being rehab and redirecting what had been then a youth institution for incarceration to a treatment institution. But I'm willing to accept that maybe there's some drivers. What new decisions and impositions of the federal courts or the receiver have occurred that have escalated the cost? Identify those. What are they? And then weigh them against the population that CDCR does not have its authority and is not responsible for. Some 2/3 of the parole agents are gone. Now maybe being redirected, but to what? They're not supervising inmates anymore because they're not under the authority of the state, or they're not supervising parolees. In any event, we need to really examine it this year. It's not acceptable to have correction spending continue to be a problem when we know that there's reductions. And Prop 47 is going to do nothing but diminish that even more. So let's try to get to the bottom of that. Mr. Cate, do you have any observation?
Let me let Mr. Soderberg respond.
Drew Soderberg, Legislative Analyst's Office. Ms. Bosler is absolutely right. Some of the primary drivers have been healthcare-related costs. Some of the facility activation costs have also driven additional costs. We'd also note, however, one factor playing into this is that some of the population reductions from realignment haven't materialized. There's a lot of different reasons for this. I mean, when the projections of the impact of realignment were done, there was limited data on how it would play out. But we've also seen behavioral changes that account for some of it. For example, the department has noticed an increase in the number of second strikers committed by counties. So part of the story is that we haven't achieved the population reductions that we originally projected. In addition, another factor that plays into this goes back to what Mr. Taylor indicated earlier. We have seen increases in pay for correctional officers, and that has driven a lot of new spending. In addition, the budget includes about $35 million for the activation of new infill facilities, and that again is part of the administration's proposal to comply with the 3-judge panel.
Well, we need to dig deeper because I'm not convinced. Okay, you speak to the correctional officer. That contract is now some 3 years old, I think. And I can't believe that we are hiring a lot more correctional officers. I don't think we are. I think we've cut back on the academy, if not stopped the academy altogether. There's certainly not a great increase, in other words, in correctional officers, which would then be obliged under that contract for paying whatever. So we need better answers. Let's work on that together, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. I just want to follow up on your point. Then we're going to get to Senator Wolk, Senator Hancock, Senator Block, Senator Roth, Senator Allen, Senator Pan. We'll get to everybody. Yes. There is a proposal for an additional 715 positions at the California healthcare facility in Stockton. I think that about doubles their staffing. Between the current year and the budget year, it's about $100 million. It's about 10% of the $1 billion increase. What what would be the need for doubling the staff at Stockton?
So my understanding is that this was a new facility, a new design of the facility, and the activation team that originally activated and planned for the staffing of the facility did not take into account some of the specific designs of the facility. And so when they really started to bring inmates in and run the facility, they realized that they were significantly short in staffing. And there was probably a lot of other issues that my colleague can go into further about why that is.
Clint Kelm, Department of Finance. Exactly, some of the physical plant layout of the facility isn't like any other facility in the state or in the country, and the concentration of highly sick inmates in one facility hasn't been seen anywhere else. So the facility overall is going to have 2,900 beds roughly, and almost more than 2,000 of those are healthcare related beds, whether that's mental health, medical, and those types of issues. So the concentration of high acuity folks in the facility wasn't really expected on what those impacts would be at the time in planning.
But there's been no change in the number of beds or the nature of the acuity. This was all known at the time of the planning. They underestimated their staffing by 100%, or we did?
Well, exactly. I think that the effects, like those effects, though they were spaced out across the state in different types of bed and maybe receiving different types of care, that concentration of the high acuity and the medical needs didn't exist anywhere else in the state or in the country, really, for this type of facility. So that was kind of trying to find a comparable throughout the process has been one of the challenges on staffing the facility. It was a trouble in the initial planning, and as we go through and kind of review proposals, continues to be one of the challenges.
Thank you. Mr. Soderberg?
Yes, there was significant operational challenges when CHCF was first activated. For example, there was at least one inmate that died. There was an outbreak of scabies. So the department undoubtedly ran into significant operational challenges. Whether the proposed staffing augmentation will be sufficient or is more than necessary to address those issues is something we're still looking into, but there were definitely issues.
Great. Thank you. Senator Wilk.